The forest stood unnervingly quiet as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting long, haunting shadows across the ground. Hunter, a large scarred mastiff with piercing amber eyes, limped through the underbrush. His once muscular frame had become gaunt from weeks without proper food, his ribs jutting out starkly beneath his matted coat, an unmistakable testament to the harshness of his lonely survival. Driven by desperation, his senses were razor-sharp. Every rustle of leaves, every faint movement sparked a fleeting hope that he might find something to quell the gnawing hunger deep in his belly. But so far the forest had been merciless. As he trudged on, a new scent tugged at him. It was faint at first, almost lost amidst the earthy smells of the woods, but it grew stronger with every step. It wasn't the scent of prey, it was something different, foreign, yet unmistakably alive. Hunter paused, his ears twitching, his nostrils flaring as he tried to pinpoint the source. Then, faintly, he heard it. A sound so soft it might have been mistaken for the whisper of the wind. But it wasn't. It was a cry, high-pitched, plaintive, filled with vulnerability. It tugged at something deep within his primal instincts. Hunter moved cautiously, his massive frame low to the ground, his amber eyes scanning the forest. Every muscle coiled, ready for danger. The cries grew louder, more distinct, until he found himself standing at the edge of a small clearing. Nestled awkwardly among the roots of a massive oak tree was the source of the sound. A baby. The child, wrapped in a tattered mud-stained blanket, flailed weakly as it wailed into the encroaching dusk. Hunter froze, his gaze locked on the infant. The sight of the child stirred conflicting instincts within him. Hunger gnawed at him mercilessly, urging him to turn away, to leave this fragile creature to its fate. But there was another instinct, one deeper, more inexplicable, that rooted him to the spot. Slowly, cautiously, Hunter took a step forward, his massive paws crunching softly against the dry leaves. The baby's cries faltered, as if sensing his presence. The dog's nose twitched, and he sniffed the air, tilting his head in curiosity. For a moment, he stood motionless, uncertainty reflected in his amber eyes. Then, against all odds, Hunter did something extraordinary. He lay down beside the baby, curling his body protectively around the tiny figure. The warmth of the infant's frail body against his own sparked something unfamiliar in him, something that felt almost like purpose. He let out a low, comforting whine, his hunger momentarily forgotten. The once feral dog, shaped by years of fighting and survival, had chosen to guard the most vulnerable creature he'd ever encountered. As the night deepened, the forest grew colder. A biting wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the distant howls of unseen predators. Yet Hunter, despite his exhaustion, remained vigilant, his body a shield around the baby. The child's cries had softened to quiet whimpers, its tiny chest rising and falling with fragile breaths. Hunter's amber eyes scanned the darkness, his ears twitching at every sound. He knew the forest was unforgiving, an endless expanse where the strong survived and the weak perished. But tonight, something was different. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was protecting something far more fragile than himself. The baby stirred, letting out a faint sound. Hunter lowered his massive head to sniff at the bundle. The child's scent was strange but not unpleasant, a mixture of earth, cloth, and innocence. His nose nudged the blanket closer around the infant, an action born not of understanding but of instinct, the deep, primal urge to protect. It overrode his hunger, his fatigue, and his pain. As the hours passed, the night brought new challenges. A rustle in the nearby bushes caused Hunter's ears to perk up. His body stiffened, his lips curling into a silent snarl as he positioned himself in front of the baby, ready to confront whatever emerged from the shadows. A pair of glowing eyes appeared, followed by a low, guttural growl of a wolf. Then another set of eyes, and another. A small pack of wolves had surrounded the clearing, their movements cautious but predatory. Hunter stood his ground, his growls growing louder, his body a barrier between the baby and the threat. The wolves circled, testing his resolve, but Hunter's stance didn't waver. He knew he was outnumbered, his weakened body no match for the pack, yet he refused to back down. One wolf lunged, its teeth aiming for Hunter's flank, but with a feral snarl, Hunter twisted, meeting the attacker head-on. His powerful jaws clamped down on the wolf's shoulder, forcing it to retreat with a yelp. Another wolf darted in from the side, But Hunter swiped at it with his massive paw, sending it tumbling into the underbrush. The fight was brutal and swift. Hunter's body was a blur of movement as he defended his fragile charge, blood staining his fur. His breathing grew ragged, his legs trembling with the effort of keeping the pack at bay. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wolves relented. One by one, they disappeared into the forest, their glowing eyes vanishing like fireflies extinguished in the dark. Hunter stood panting, his body covered in scratches and bites, his head hanging low, his muscles quivering. Yet his resolve remained unbroken. He turned back to the baby, who was miraculously unharmed. Its small face peeked out from the blanket. Hunter nudged the infant gently, his warm breath brushing against its tiny cheek. The baby stirred, letting out a soft sound, almost like gratitude. The night pressed on, but the bond between dog and child had grown stronger. Hunter knew they couldn't stay in the open. He had to find shelter, somewhere safe where he could protect the baby without constant threats looming overhead. With a low whine, Hunter carefully gripped the edge of the baby's blanket in his teeth, lifting the infant as gently as he could. Every step was deliberate, his body battered but his spirit unyielding. The faint scent of water reached his nose, and he followed it, hoping to find a place where they could rest and recover. The forest opened up to a small stream, its clear water glistening under the moonlight. Hunter set the baby down on a soft patch of moss, his eyes scanning the surroundings for danger. He dipped his head into the stream, drinking deeply to quench his thirst. Once he had his fill, he returned to the baby, nudging the blanket closer to the water's edge. Hunter lapped at the water, wetting the child's lips in the hopes of reviving it. The baby stirred weakly, its tiny hand twitching as it sensed the cool moisture. Hunter let out a soft, contented whine. Against all odds, he had found something to protect, something worth living for. The baby clutched onto the stream, offering Hunter a brief moment of respite. But he knew they couldn't stay here for long. The forest was a hostile environment for something so fragile. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon, catching sight of a crumbling structure in the distance. A cabin, nearly swallowed by vines and shadows. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. With renewed determination, Hunter hoisted the baby again, his steps slow but steady. The journey to the cabin was grueling. The baby's tiny weight was nothing compared to the wounds that plagued his own body. But the true burden was not physical. It was the suffocating responsibility to keep this delicate life safe. Every step through the dense, silent forest felt like it carried the weight of the world. The wind rustled through the trees, and distant owl calls echoed in the dark, but Hunter pressed on, focused, unwavering. When they finally reached the cabin, it was a pitiful sight. The roof sagged from years of neglect, and the walls were cracked and weathered. Broken windows let the moonlight spill through, casting eerie silver streaks across the dilapidated structure. Yet, to Hunter, it wasn't just a ruin, it was a sanctuary. With a grunt, he pushed open the door, the old wood creaking in protest. Inside, the air was stale, dry, and the ground was covered in dust and debris. But it was enough. Hunter stepped carefully over the threshold, his paws leaving faint prints in the dust as he moved to a corner sheltered from the drafts. Gently, he laid the baby on a patch of dry earth, making sure the blanket covered it tightly. The infant stirred slightly, tiny fingers curling around the fabric. Hunter watched, his amber eyes softening at the sight. For a moment, he allowed himself a fleeting rest, lowering his body beside the baby, wrapping his body protectively around it. The rhythmic rise and fall of his chest soothed the baby into a peaceful slumber. But his rest was brief. A faint rustling from outside shattered the stillness. Hunter's body tensed. The forest had quieted, an unnatural stillness settling over the night. Then a low growl rumbled from the darkness. Hunter's hackles rose, muscles coiling in response. Through the broken window, he saw the flicker of glowing eyes. The wolves were back. Their scent reached him, sharp and musky, mingling with the damp earth. They hadn't given up. They were still hunting him. Positioning himself between the baby and the approaching danger, Hunter's massive form became a living barrier. The wolves circled, their silhouettes flickering like shadows, a haunting presence in the dark. One wolf stepped closer, its fangs bared, eyes fixed on the bundle behind Hunter. The primal urge to protect surged through him, stronger than his pain, stronger than exhaustion. The lead wolf lunged, its jaws snapping just inches from Hunter's face. With a ferocious snarl, Hunter met the attack, his powerful jaws clamping down on the wolf's shoulder and tossing it aside. Another wolf lunged at his flank, but Hunter twisted, landing a blow that sent it skidding across the floor. Despite his injuries, he fought with a ferocity fueled not just by survival, but by the need to protect what mattered most. The battle was chaos. Growls, yelps, and the sound of bodies colliding filled the cabin. Dust swirled in the air, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. Outnumbered and with his strength waning, Hunter fought on. His resolve never faltered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wolves retreated, bloodied and limping. They vanished into the forest, their glowing eyes fading into the shadows. Hunter stood in the center of the cabin, his body trembling, his breath ragged. Blood matted his fur, his muscles screaming for rest. But his first thought was for the baby. He limped toward it, his heart racing. Nudging the blanket with his nose, he checked. The baby was unharmed, its chest rising and falling steadily. Hunter let out a soft, relieved whine, lowering himself beside the child, curling his body protectively around it. Despite the temporary silence, his instincts remained sharp. The memory of the wolves lingered, a constant threat. The forest was relentless, and the cabin wouldn't be safe forever. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the broken windows, casting a golden glow over the room. Hunter stirred, his body aching as he rose to his feet. The baby shifted, tiny hands reaching toward the warmth of the morning light. Hunter's amber eyes were filled with exhaustion and determination as he watched. He knew their journey was far from over. The forest wouldn't forgive weakness. The baby needed more than his protection. They needed food, water, and a safe place to stay. A home where the child could thrive. And Hunter was determined to find it, no matter the cost. His body protested with every step as he left the cabin that morning, the sunlight barely easing the weight of exhaustion in his bones. He had to find food and water, not just for himself, but for the fragile life he had sworn to protect. The baby had stirred softly as he left, and its tiny whimpers echoed in the still air. He hated leaving it behind, but he knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. The forest, calmer in the daylight, held no comfort for Hunter. His instincts remained on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a bird, set his senses on edge. He tracked the faint scent of moisture in the air, leading him deeper into the woods. His paws left faint prints in the damp earth as the sun rose higher, its warmth brushing against his fur, but Hunter remained focused. Finally, he found a small stream trickling over moss-covered rocks. The sound of water was a balm to his parched throat. Hunter approached cautiously, scanning the area for danger. After ensuring the area was clear, he drank, the cool water easing his dry throat. His body relaxed slightly, the weight of exhaustion lifting just enough for him to breathe easier. But his brief moment of reprieve was cut short. As he drank, an unfamiliar scent on the breeze made him pause. Metallic and acrid, it mingled with the earthy aromas of the forest. His ears flattened as he raised his head, scanning the area. The scent was getting stronger. Cautiously, he moved deeper into the underbrush. What he found made his heart race. A human campsite, abandoned, its remains scattered across the forest floor. Hunter sniffed the ground, piecing together the grim story. There had been a struggle here. Blood was fresh, and the ground was disturbed with footprints and claw marks. The scent of predators lingered, wolves perhaps, or something larger. Hunter's mind raced. This could have been the baby's fate if he hadn't found it first, if he hadn't stepped in. With newfound resolve, Hunter searched the wreckage. Among the debris, he found a small satchel, its contents scattered. Scraps of food, stale but edible, and a flask that still held a few drops of water. He grabbed the satchel and hurried back to the cabin, his steps quickening with urgency. When he returned, the baby was awake. Its cries filled the cabin, a stark reminder of the responsibility that lay on Hunter's broad shoulders. He nudged the satchel toward the child, then settled beside it. The baby's cries softened as Hunter lay down, curling his warm body around it. He nudged the flask closer, letting a few drops of water wet the baby's lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. As the day wore on, Hunter remained vigilant. The memory of the abandoned campsite haunted him. The thought that whatever had caused such destruction might still be out there gnawed at him. The distant howls of wolves echoed through the forest, and Hunter's body tensed instinctively. He stood near the door, his sharp eyes fixed on the darkness outside. The wolves were close. Their presence was a constant reminder that danger was never far. But Hunter's determination burned brighter than his fear. He let out a low growl, a warning to the unseen predators that this place was off limits. The baby stirred behind him, and Hunter glanced back, his heart swelling with the protective instinct that had come to define him. For now, the cabin was their haven. But Hunter knew it wouldn't be enough. The forest was merciless. Survival required constant vigilance. He would find a permanent solution, a place where the baby could grow safely, far from the claws and teeth of predators. Hunter's amber eyes gleamed in the dim light as he stood guard through the night. The weight of his new purpose settled over him. He had faced countless battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just survival. This was hope, fragile but undeniable. And he would fight for it with everything he had. The night deepened, and the forest fell silent again. Hunter remained at the door, his massive frame silhouetted against the faint moonlight seeping through the cracks. The baby rested behind him, and the forest around them waited, holding its breath. The baby was finally asleep, its tiny breaths a soothing rhythm in the otherwise tense atmosphere, but Hunter's senses remained sharp, his ears flicking at every distant sound. The memory of the abandoned campsite gnawed at his mind. Whatever had caused the destruction out there wasn't far behind. Then he heard it, a soft rustling in the underbrush. It was faint at first, barely a whisper against the wind, but it grew louder, more deliberate. Hunter's body tensed, his amber eyes narrowing as he focused on the sound. His nose caught the scent before his eyes could confirm it. Wolves, multiple wolves, and they were close. The musky odor of their presence mingled with the dampness of the forest floor. He let out a low growl, his lips curling back to expose his sharp teeth. The baby stirred behind him but didn't wake. The soft rise and fall of its tiny chest was a reminder of everything that was at stake. He glanced at the fragile bundle nestled in the corner, a precious life he had sworn to protect. He couldn't let them get inside. The cabin was their only safe haven, and he was its last line of defense. The first wolf appeared at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. It was massive, its fur dark and matted, its lean frame speaking of hunger. Another followed, then another. Their movements were stealthy, calculated. These were not ordinary wolves. They were predators in every sense of the word. Hunter stepped forward, his growl deepening into a warning rumble that echoed through the silence. The wolves paused, their eyes fixed on him, assessing, testing. Then the largest of the pack stepped forward. Its ears flattened, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Hunter didn't flinch. He stood his ground, every muscle coiled, every nerve taut, ready for what was coming. The lead wolf lunged, its speed and precision unmatched. Hunter met it head-on, their bodies colliding with a force that shook the earth beneath them. His powerful jaws snapped down on the wolf's shoulder, sending a pained yelp into the night. But before he could savor the moment, another wolf darted in from the side, its teeth sinking into his hind leg. Pain shot through him, but Hunter twisted, using his massive frame to throw the second attacker off balance. The battle raged on, chaotic and fierce, a blur of snarls, snapping jaws, and tearing claws. His focus never wavered, his body moving with the single-minded purpose of keeping the wolves away from the baby. Every strike, every blow was fueled by a raw, desperate need to protect what he had sworn to guard. He landed a crushing blow on one wolf, sending it tumbling across the clearing, but the others were relentless. They circled him, their growls an ominous, vibrating chorus that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Blood stained the ground beneath them, the metallic scent mingling with the earthy aroma of the forest. Hunter's muscles burned, exhaustion seeping into his bones with every movement. But he didn't relent. He couldn't. A wolf attempted to slip past him, its eyes locked on the cabin door, but Hunter intercepted it with a savage slam of his body, forcing it back. His protective instincts flared, overriding every ounce of pain, every ounce of fatigue. The baby's safety was his only priority. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wolves began to retreat. Their leader, battered and limping, let out a guttural snarl before turning and vanishing into the shadows. One by one, the others followed, their glowing eyes fading into the darkness. Hunter stood, his chest heaving, blood matted in his fur, but his vigilance never wavered. The battle was over, for now. But he knew it was far from over. The night was far from silent, and every rustle of the wind, every whisper in the trees, sent his senses on high alert. He limped back to the cabin, his movements slow, labored, his body screaming for rest, but he couldn't afford to give in. As he pushed the door open gently, his eyes immediately sought the baby. It was still asleep, its tiny form curled within the folds of the blanket. A wave of relief washed over him like a tide, but it was brief. The battle had taken its toll, but his duty wasn't done. Not yet. Hunter lowered himself onto the ground beside the child, his body curling protectively around it. Every movement sent jolts of pain through him, but he ignored it. His duty to the baby surpassed any personal suffering. His head rested against the floor, his eyes never leaving the door, his ears alert to any sign of danger. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. The baby stirred in its sleep, a faint whimper escaping its lips. Hunter nudged it gently with his nose, his warm breath calming the child back into a peaceful slumber. And as the forest around them remained quiet, the weight of the night's battle heavy on his body, Hunter stayed awake. He would stay vigilant. He would always be there, guarding the child with his life, no matter what came next. The night stretched on, and though Hunter's body ached and his wounds throbbed, he refused to close his eyes. The baby was safe for now, but he knew the wolves would return. As dawn began to break, casting soft light across the forest, Hunter allowed himself to relax slightly. The fight had left him battered and exhausted, but he had protected the baby. That was all that mattered. The sunlight filtering through the cracks in the cabin's walls brought a fleeting sense of peace, a reminder that they had survived another night. But deep down, Hunter knew this was only the beginning. The wolves weren't the only danger lurking in the forest, and the baby's cries could easily attract more predators. He needed a plan, something to ensure their safety beyond the fragile walls of the cabin. His amber eyes gleamed with determination as he glanced at the sleeping child. No matter what lay ahead, he would protect it. Together they would survive. The morning sun bathed the forest in a soft golden light, but the tranquility was deceptive. Hunter's body stirred, aching from the battle, his fur matted with dried blood. Every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his muscles, but he couldn't afford to rest. He rose to his feet, scanning the cabin for any signs of disturbance. The baby was still there, nestled in its blanket, its small chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Hunter moved toward the door, his movements slow but deliberate. He poked his nose outside, sniffing the cool morning air for any trace of the wolves. The faint metallic tang of blood still lingered, but the predators were gone, for now. Still, Hunter's instincts told him they couldn't stay here. The cabin offered some protection, but it was exposed, vulnerable. If the wolves returned with greater numbers, or if other dangers appeared, Hunter wouldn't be able to fend them off again. He turned back to the baby, nudging it gently with his nose. The child stirred, its tiny hands reaching out instinctively for warmth. Hunter gave a soft huff, a sound of reassurance before retreating to the door. He needed to find food and water, not just for himself, but for the baby as well. His strength was waning, and his protective instincts could only carry him so far. Outside the cabin, the forest seemed to hum with life. Birds called to one another from the treetops, and the underbrush rustled with the movements of small animals. But Hunter paid them no mind. His focus was on survival, on finding the essentials that would keep them both alive. He ventured a short distance from the cabin, his ears swiveling constantly, alert for any signs of danger. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves and broken branches, every step a reminder of how fragile their situation was. Hunter's keen nose picked up the scent of water, faint but unmistakable. He followed it cautiously, weaving through the dense trees until he came upon a small stream. The clear water sparkled in the sunlight, and Hunter approached it carefully, his ears twitching at every sound. He drank deeply, the cold liquid soothing his parched throat and restoring a fraction of his strength. Once he was satisfied, he glanced back in the direction of the cabin. The baby would need water too, but how could he bring it back? His eyes fell on a discarded plastic bottle, tangled in the roots of a nearby tree. The sight stirred something in his memory, a distant recollection of humans and their strange tools. Hunter padded over to the bottle, picking it up carefully in his jaws. The plastic crinkled under his teeth, but it held together. He filled it at the stream, tilting his head to ensure it wouldn't spill, and began the careful trek back to the cabin. When he returned, the baby was awake, its soft cries filling the small space. Hunter hurried to its side, setting the bottle down and nudging the blanket with his nose. The child's tiny fists flailed, its face scrunched in distress. Hunter whined softly, unsure of how to soothe it. He licked its cheek, the gesture gentle and instinctive. The baby's cries quieted to small whimpers. Hunter tipped the bottle slightly, letting a few drops of water fall onto the child's lips. The baby responded, its mouth moving instinctively to drink. Relief washed over Hunter as he watched, his protective instincts reaffirmed. But this was only a temporary solution. They needed more than water. They needed food, shelter, and a solid plan. The sound of rustling leaves outside the cabin snapped Hunter to attention. His ears perked and his body tensed as he moved to the door. He sniffed the air, his heart pounding at the familiar scent. Wolves. They hadn't given up. Hunter growled low in his throat, his body blocking the doorway as his eyes scanned the forest for movement. The wolves were smarter this time, staying hidden among the trees. They were waiting, watching. Hunter's heart raced as he stood at the threshold, his protective instincts flaring. He would fight again if he had to. He would never let them harm the baby. This time, he would be ready. The forest was alive with threats, but Hunter was ready to face them all. The baby's life depended on it. And nothing would break his resolve. The wolves watched from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that could not be ignored. Hunter could feel their gaze tracking his every move, their silent presence pressing down on him like a weight. They were waiting to test his resolve. He knew he couldn't let them linger. If they attacked again, his weakened state would leave him at a severe disadvantage. He turned back to the baby, nudging it gently. The child's wide eyes stared up at him, sensing the tension in the air. Hunter knew he had to act quickly. Staying in the cabin was no longer an option. They needed to move. They had to find a safer place, somewhere the wolves couldn't follow. But the journey would be treacherous, especially with his injuries slowing him down. Hunter carefully picked up the baby, wrapping it gently in its blanket and cradling it in his jaws. He stepped outside, his eyes darting to the shadows where the wolves lurked. A low growl rumbled in his throat as he took the first cautious step away from the cabin. The wolves didn't move, but Hunter could feel their eyes on him, their presence pressing in. The forest seemed to close around them as he moved, each step heavy with the weight of the danger behind him. The baby's warmth against his chest was the only thing giving him strength, reminding him of why he couldn't afford to stop. Every step felt like a battle. His injured leg protested with each movement, but he pressed on, ears constantly swiveling for sounds of pursuit. The wolves followed at a distance, their silent presence a constant threat. Hunter's mind raced, searching for a solution. He needed higher ground, somewhere defensible, where he could protect the baby if the wolves attacked again. His amber eyes scanned the forest, looking for any advantage. Finally, he spotted it. A rocky outcrop rising above the dense underbrush. It wasn't much, but it was elevated and surrounded by steep inclines. If he could reach it, he could keep the wolves at bay. Hunter adjusted his grip on the baby and began the climb. His claws scraped against the rough stone as he pulled himself upward. But the wolves weren't far behind. Their snarls echoed through the forest as they broke from the shadows, their lean bodies darting toward him. Hunter growled, quickening his pace despite the pain shooting through his limbs. He reached the top just as the first wolf lunged, its jaws snapping inches from his tail. Hunter turned sharply, his body a wall of muscle and determination as he faced the pack. The baby was behind him, safe for now, but the fight was far from over. He let out a fierce bark, the sound reverberating through the trees like a thunderclap. The wolves hesitated, their movements uncertain as they assessed the challenge before them. Hunter knew this was his moment to act. He couldn't let the wolves gain the upper hand. His protective instincts flared, overriding his exhaustion. He braced himself, his muscular frame shielding the baby from view as the wolves advanced, their eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. They spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any escape routes. The lead wolf, larger than the others, with a patch of silver streaking its fur, let out a low growl, a sound that sent shivers through the forest. Hunter didn't flinch. Despite his injuries, his protective instinct surged forward, sharpening his senses and steadying his resolve. He let out a guttural snarl, his lips pulling back to reveal sharp teeth. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the tiny life depending on him. The first wolf lunged, teeth snapping toward Hunter's throat. He twisted his body, deflecting the attack with a powerful shove of his shoulder. The wolf stumbled but quickly recovered, circling back to join the others. A second wolf darted in from the side, aiming for Hunter's flank. He reacted with lightning speed, his jaws closing around the wolf's scruff and tossing it aside. The yelp of pain echoed through the forest, but the pack wasn't deterred. The lead wolf took a step forward, its eyes locking onto Hunter's. For a moment, there was a silent exchange, a battle of wills. Then, as if on an unspoken signal, the pack attacked in unison. Hunter met them head-on, his powerful body moving with a grace and precision born of years of survival. Teeth clashed and growls filled the air. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the fight raged on. One wolf managed to clamp its jaws onto Hunter's hind leg, but he twisted violently, throwing it off before it could do serious damage. Another wolf leapt for his throat, but Hunter ducked and countered, his teeth sinking into the wolf's shoulder. Despite his fierce defense, the numbers began to take their toll. Hunter's movements grew slower, his breaths more labored. Blood matted his fur and his legs trembled under the strain. But every time the wolves came close to the baby, a surge of strength coursed through him, a reason to keep fighting. The baby, oblivious to the danger, let out a soft cry from behind him. The sound pierced through the chaos, momentarily halting the wolves' assault. Hunter used the brief pause to reposition himself, placing the baby in a shallow crevice in the rock where it would be harder for the wolves to reach. He turned back to the pack, his growl deepening as he prepared for another round. The lead wolf growled a command, and the pack advanced again. More cautiously this time. They had underestimated Hunter's determination, but they were relentless. The lead wolf lunged, its jaws snapping dangerously close to Hunter's face. He dodged, his movements slower but still precise, and countered with a powerful swipe of his paw. The wolf yelped, blood staining its silver fur, but it didn't back down. The fight raged on, each moment a test of Hunter's endurance. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. His vision blurred, his muscles screamed in protest, and his breaths came in ragged gasps. But he refused to falter. Every growl, every bite, every step was a declaration the baby would survive, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the faint crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Hunter's ears perked, his body tensing as he strained to identify the source. The wolves hesitated, their ears flicking toward the noise. It grew louder, closer, and Hunter caught a whiff of something that made his heart race, a human scent. Out of the dense underbrush emerged a figure, a man with a weathered face and a rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes widened at the scene before him, a scarred, bloodied dog, standing between the baby and the wolves. The man's expression shifted from surprise to determination, his hand gripping the rifle. Without hesitation, he raised it, taking aim at the pack. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the forest held its breath. Hunter stood firm, the baby's cries still echoing softly in the background. This was the final stand, the moment where everything would either end in tragedy or in survival. And in the chaos of the wolves advancing, the man's rifle shot rang out. The sound a loud crack that pierced the silence, turning the tide of the battle.